Gigi Young is an educator on many esoteric topics, and in a recent post, she speaks about the attributes of the Antichrist. And she's covered the Antichrist in many videos, particularly about his association with technology and transhumanism. But in this post, she very interestingly connects him with the moon. So from the perspective of Vedic astrology, it's natural to see why the Antichrist is connected to the moon. So the moon is the force within all of us of our individual ego and our mind in the most subjective sense. And so the key to that phrase is within all of us, because I continually say that the foundation of why astrology works is that we have these forces within us. Each planet resides within us. So the moon is a physical object in the sky. And just like all of the other planets, we carry that energetic force, that frequency of the moon within us as well. So the planetary alignments in the sky, or the arrangement of those frequencies relative to each other the moment that we're born, the moment we leave our mother's womb, though that energetic arrangement sets the foundation of our psychological character. And so Gigi is correct that the Antichrist figure is not an abstract concept or something like our shadow self or an archetype of evil. It's an actual being who plays a role in the divine play of our universe. And the Antichrist's focus on technology is connected to the effect that the moon force has in our consciousness when it's taken to a toxic extreme. And what that is the obsession with the personal ego, an extreme sense of individualism, and the elevation of the fulfillment of personal desires as the pinnacle of happiness. And so technology is an isolating force into an individual self, and the moon taken to an extreme has that same effect. So we all have this moon force within us, and so we all have an ego that is important to living life as a human being. The ego isn't in and of itself negative. So also it's important to understand that the moon is a receptive force, meaning that in order to be healthy, we have to be receiving healthy things into our lives for our ego to be healthy. And there are many ways to dissect this astrologically, and such as the moon being influenced by other planets, the sign positions, etc. But when the lunar force, the moon force within us is toxic, not only is that person more prone to be receiving negative ideas and negative influences, which then generate destructive ideas about oneself, but also the person can become dependent on receiving from the outside world for inner ego validation. And that's why the toxic moon consciousness leads to materialism, and how the Antichrist corrupts the ego via the materialism of the moon. And Gigi also talks about the danger of a person becoming dissolved into the moon, becoming what she says as food for the moon. And there are etheric beings that feed off of that frequency. And then finally losing ourselves completely in that lunar force if a person is not able to overcome or advance beyond the lessons that the lunar force is teaching us, what our ego lessons are in our life. If we don't learn from it, we can easily lose ourselves in it. And this idea of losing ourselves in the moon is directly referenced in a very powerful Vedic story from the Srimad Bhagavatam about a sage named Maharaj Bharata, or just Bharata. And I tell the story of Bharata as one of the past lives of my character Koji in my film Vedic Nights. So the Vedic story, it's from Canto 5, Chapter 8 of the Srimad Bhagavatam. It tells us that Bharata spends his time in deep meditation in the forest. But one day he discovers a weak fawn who he takes into his ashram. And he becomes so attached to the fawn as it grows into a deer that he disregards his meditative practices. He becomes very distracted and he does not continue his spiritual journey. And he becomes so emotionally attached to this being which is outside of him that at the end of his life, he becomes a deer. He reincarnates into the body of a deer. And all throughout the tale, as it's written in this ancient Vedic text, there are references to the moon as the primary energetic cause of his growing separation from himself, and thus attaching himself to this external entity, the deer. And directly from the text, it says, Bharata continued to speak like a madman, seeing above his head the dark marks of the rising moon, which resembled a deer. He said, "Can it be that the moon, which is so kind to an unhappy man, might also be kind upon my deer, knowing that it has strayed from home and has become motherless?" And in the next sutra it says, after perceiving the moonshine, Maharaja Bharata continued speaking like a crazy person. He said, "The deer's son was so submissive and dear to me that due to its separation, I am feeling separation from my own son. Due to the burning fever of this separation, I am suffering as if inflamed by a forest fire. Seeing me so distressed, the moon is certainly splashing its shining nectar upon me, just as a friend throws water on another friend who has a high fever. In this way, the moon is bringing me happiness." And later on, in a verse shortly after that, it says, the king, who is Bharata, because he was a king in a past life, saying, "The king was so engrossed in petting and maintaining the deer that he fell down from his spiritual activities." So in other words, what this story is saying is that the sage Bharata experienced a fall. He lost himself in the material world. And when he reincarnates as the deer, however, he was given the benefit of not having forgotten why he had fallen. And so when he incarnates as a human being again after the life of a deer, he then dedicates himself to become completely detached from material life, so as not to experience another spiritual fall. And so this is telling us that when Bharata became so engrossed in the deer, separating himself from his spiritual pursuits, that object outside of him became such a focus of attachment. He became so emotionally dependent upon that outside object that he lost his spiritual standing. So that focus on an outside object, that focus on the material world, in this case the form of a deer, caused him to become separated from himself. And that is the essential process of what the lunar force can do. And it's becoming emotionally dependent on the outside world to feel good within oneself. And as you can see in the animation that I was directing with my animator, I made it very important part of the visual storytelling to include that when Bharata dies, his soul merges into the moon. And this is also directly referenced in the Srimad Bhagavatam in another earlier section of the book. So that comes from Canto 3, chapter 32, verse 3. And it says, "Such materialistic persons, attracted by sense gratification and devoted to the forefathers and demigods, can be elevated to the moon, where they drink an extract of the soma plant. They again return to this planet." So there is a deep correlation with what Gigi Young is telling us about the character and the attraction and draw and fundamental force of the Antichrist being connected to the moon and the fundamental kind of materialistic draw that the moon does. And this is supported by ancient Vedic text and Vedic astrology. So the moon, as our subjective mind and ego consciousness, when it becomes toxic and over-receptive of the material world, we lose contact with our true selves, which is the force of the sun within us, which is our ability to connect and communicate with our immortal soul beyond materialistic death and beyond the finite material world. And so when we're often told about how the Antichrist seeks to, quote unquote, own our souls, he seeks to accomplish this through the merging of our bodies with technology to draw a person out of contact with their immortal soul, that is residing within them, and to become dependent upon these technologies. And this is, as you can see, in a similar way to how Bharata became dependent upon the well-being of the deer. And so he lost himself in that process. So the Antichrist is seeking to draw ourselves out of ourselves and using the lunar force to become dependent on things outside of us to make us feel good. And so one way to do that is simply by drawing ourselves out of us to physical objects, to the technologies. And then when you merge that technology into your body, you're becoming so deeply dependent on a materialistic object that you can't live without it. And that process separates you from the ability to be in contact with your eternal soul. And so, as you can see, the lunar force is essentially taking a person outside of that inner contact with oneself through materialistic pursuits.